perfect example of synesthesia just there, because
Oh,
I
you're
think
quite.
Succession would have been nothing without the music.
Completely. No. Just as I mounted the stage and that music came, I could imagine at least 90% of the audience channeling their inner Brian Cox and thinking, F off.
Talking of that, by the way, I thought very interesting, we had a primatologist speak earlier today. I thought Trump's extraordinary surgical use of fuck was an extraordinary kind of action, wasn't it? In terms of kind of weird power demonstration by breaking the established rules.
Completely. So you don't expect, I mean, even though Trump is, you're absolutely right, he's a primate, he's a silverback, he operates according to the rules of the jungle. We might say more about that. So far, his actual, even though physically he's imposing, and even though he loves demonstrations of power, his language so far has tended to imply violence and cloak menace rather than reveal it. So, he will talk about, he will say, Rory, a lot of people tell me Rory Sutherland is a beautiful guy. Such a great guy. But Rory, I think you're maybe a little bit wrong about this. And implied in that is, if you disagree with me, I will kill you.
Yes.
But what he hasn't done hitherto, or only very rarely, is go full Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, that was a first, I think.
It was a first.
As I know, yeah.
And in so doing, I think the other thing is, normally, one of the things about the use of his language is that he's conveying the impression of power, because what he wants to do is also show that there's, unbelievably for him, an element of restraint there. That he has controlled violence at his disposal. And the fact that he was displaying frustration then, provoked the question, was it calculated frustration?
Yeah.
Was he trying to say to the players there, Israel and Iran, look, I am, transgressing a boundary that I haven't gone through before? Is this use of language calculated? Or was it genuine exasperation? Was it the case that he had, at that moment, felt that the way in which he was portraying himself to the world as the great peacemaker was being confounded by the actions of people whom he couldn't control?
Because there was an interesting behavior observed in sort of alpha chimps, which is if there's a dispute which frustrates them, they basically go and effectively run through it and slap both parties.
Exactly.
Which is an interesting move, because the conventional view has always been you have to take sides
in
some respect.
Yes, but by doing that, and of course, very sophisticated readers of geopolitics will have thought, what does this mean? Does that mean that he's slightly less sympathetic to Israel and slightly more sympathetic to Iran? What does that mean in terms of the split between the MAGA faction and the tech bro faction in Republican or in American governmental circles? But you are right. The correct way to look at it was not to overthink it, but to recognize that one of the characteristics of Trump and the way in which he operates politically is operating precisely in that way as the apex predator or the alpha primate. And it is one of the striking things about Trump when you encounter him that overall what he's doing, he's searching, sniffing the environment, searching for weakness, and also thinking, can I enlist you? Will you be part of my pride or tribe? And again, the aim is either win over, and by winning over, that doesn't mean that you become an equal. It means that you become a subject, a tool, but still one that he will work with, or you will be mocked and ostracized. So the very first time that I met Trump, when I was shown into his office, the striking thing is I came in with a German journalist called Kai Diekmann, and Trump said, as soon as we came in, look at these two handsome guys. No one has ever said that to me whenever I've entered any room. So he was seeking literally to disarm. But one of the other things that you've seen exhibited is the way in which he's used particular language about his opponents, low energy Jeb or lying Ted for Ted Cruz. What he's doing there is he's doing what the schoolyard bully does and what most of us would not do, which is that even when we recognize a weakness and we're aware of it, we wouldn't surface it, make it explicit in such a way as to humiliate. But what Trump does do is that he seeks to do that in order to demonstrate that he is in control of any social situation and in control politically.
Got it. I mean, there is an element in electoral appeal in popularism in that which, I mean, I have huge rows with my wife about this, but I argue that it's refreshing for the electorate. In a sense, of course, people, many, many politicians notionally have power. The electorate expects them to have almost limitless power because they're far up the pyramid of power from most voters. And yet they're so constrained either legally or by, effectively, government expenditure which is already committed or whatever, that actually the levers they can pull are remarkably few. And so it's quite refreshing to see someone with an amygdala.
Yes.
That's something I've always found, which is that, in a sense, even if some of this power is faked, you are at least acting as though you have it.
Yes.
In the way that, it's the difference between concrete language, like we're going to build a wall. But what Hillary would have said is, we will have tripartite talks with our Canadian and Mexican friends, okay? Whereas Trump says something concrete about a wall. And in a sense, this is actually a weakness which I would argue cerebral or technocratic politicians have kind of created. It's of their own making to some degree.
I think that's completely right. I think that the amygdala, the lizard brain, is an underappreciated part of politics overall. Yeah. Most people who rise through the political or public policy world are almost by definition people who are rational, who operate by looking at the play of ideas and making a judgment about trade-offs. And normally it's one that is illuminated by graphs, by scientific studies, by statistics, and so on. So again, there might be a discussion about migration in which you would look at the net economic benefit that accrues from a certain number of people coming to this country set against the costs that there may be of educating their children or looking after their dependents and so on. But most people react to most public policy decisions not on the basis of a seminar study, but on the basis of emotion. And that emotion will often be shaped by those around them or by their own experience. And that means that when things are perceived to be going wrong in a country, whatever the factor may be, the natural tendency of policymakers is to seek to explain how difficult things are, how constrained they are by lack of money, by legal conventions, by the need for nuance. But for a country, whether it's America, Britain, France, Germany, whatever, for a country that feels that anxiety, what it looks for is someone who can articulate it and punch through. And that is one of the reasons why Trump has been electorally, I'm not saying in policy terms, electorally successful, because in the face of what appear to be excuses and evasion, he offers action and decision.
It's very, very interesting, yeah. Yeah, and also speed of action. I mean,
yes.
To the point of impetuousness, undoubtedly.
Yes.
But the very pace in which tariffs were signed in.
Yes.
I mean, it's actually done very theatrically, isn't it? By having enormous, great things signed by him personally.
Oh, yes.
And he sits there and signs sort of 10 things in a row.
Well, one of the things that is very powerfully true of Trump is people said before he entered the presidential race, what experience does this guy have? He's got no experience running. He's never been a governor. He's never been a senator. How absurd. But one of the things that he understood and appreciated is that the judgment that people make about politicians has moved. So it's still the case, and I think overwhelmingly it would be a case for an audience like this, that people would make a judgment about a politician on the quality of their argument, on their credentials for office, on their capacity to run something. But overall, now, politics, like so many other things, has become performative and theatrical, and Trump was perfectly trained for that. Because he'd spent, I think it was 14 or 15 seasons.
Yes.
Presenting The Apprentice.
And wrestling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he knew exactly how to communicate effectively to a mass audience, and he knew how to, in a few sentences, convey a sense of either anger or to solidarity with an audience. And also he had naturally, but he developed perfect comic timing, and perfect rhetorical aplomb in the way in which he presented. And we may deprecate it, but communication is an essential political skill. There are people who are gifted administrators, there are people who are highly moral, but in a world where, in an attention economy where the amount of time that people devote to political questions inevitably is constrained, then the capacity to be able to cut through is a gift, even if it's one that may be used for malign ends.
It's fascinating. You yourself, I mean, your own experience, you said, of cabinet meetings was that so much was actually decided before it was presented to you.
Yes.
That although notionally you had considerable power, I think you spoke of the difference of power as it's imagined, which is someone standing on a balcony.
Yes, no, quite.
Yeah.
So we use shorthand all the time. So we say, you know, people would sometimes say to me, just as a lowly cabinet minister, oh, you must be terribly busy running the country. I wasn't running the country. Prime Minister doesn't run the country in the way that even the CEO of Ogilvy or Nestle or Sprite might run that company. And we know that the CEO, in that case, he or she, will have certain KPIs, certain statistical outturns that can help them understand what's going on. They will get feedback from their senior leadership team, but they won't know every aspect of what's going on. And as we just heard in the discussion about a whole marketing campaign for Sprite, the lawyers constrained what would happen. Now, magnify that 10 or 100-fold, and you have an understanding of government. There are lawyers, special interest groups. There are outside bodies, NGOs, and watchdogs, all of which have been set up for good reasons. You can argue that we've moved too far in the direction of constraint on executive power, or you can argue that it's a wholly good thing. But it is certainly the case that the unconstrained ability of someone to cut through scarcely exists. And there's another thing as well, which is it's not just the case that the Prime Minister and other cabinet ministers don't exercise the power that we often attribute to them. People often assume that cabinet is an idealized discussion forum. And that in cabinet, you have cabinet government, and the Prime Minister thinks, you know, these welfare reforms, maybe shall we consider this? Tell me, you know, what do you think, Rory? What do you think, Liz? What do you think, Rachel? And that there's a sort of 90-minute first principles discussion around it before they come to a conclusion. Now, I don't think there are many business meetings like that, but that is certainly not what happens in a cabinet meeting. Because almost always, each of the cabinet ministers will have been briefed beforehand on what it is that is likely to be proposed, and they will have been briefed on how it affects their department and their prestige. So they will speak to the interests of the Welsh office and how this change might affect Welsh budgets or whatever. If they do stray beyond, and sometimes people do, there is a big risk. If I'm the person putting forward the benefit reforms, and I've worked very hard on them and my prestige is attached to them, and then Rory, as the Education Secretary, says, look, you know, Liz, Michael, very interesting here. Have you really thought this through? I've just looked at this, I've just added the figures up, and this actually won't save us £5 billion. It'll only save 3.5, and it will drive some people who are currently in receipt of benefits into poverty. I just don't think that's a good idea. Now, you or I might have that discussion if we're at a broad level of equality and we're in a shared enterprise, but even then it might be quite a difficult discussion. It almost never happens around the cabinet table. Because if you're the person who does that, the person on the other end, the person listening, thinks, I will kill this wanker. And the immediate thing that they are likely to do is to brief their spads, that there's a wanker around the cabinet table who's trying to derail things. You will find that if you're what you believe to be grit in the oyster, that actually stories seem to appear about how things are going wrong in your own department. And what had hitherto been a beautiful friendship where you felt that candor was a characteristic that you could share, turns into, at best, a frozen friendship, but far more likely a fratricidal Sopranos-style wet job perpetrated on you at some point in the future. So that's why people around the cabinet table tend to keep their heads down, tend to, you know, allow individual X or individual Y to put things forward, because even though they should be thinking collectively, and it should be a space for dissent, actually it's in the nature of politics, and here we go back to conflict between primates, that candor rarely occurs. It's a blessing when it does. And again, just as a sort of final footnote to that, there are sometimes people whose authority within cabinet, even if they're not prime minister, the locus, the respect in which they're held for their mastery of politics and their position in the hierarchy, means they can do that. So a George Osborne, a chancellor, again, whatever you think of his policies, a chancellor who is known to be both politically agile, and to be close to the Prime Minister, and with the weight of the Treasury behind him, can, in a cabinet discussion, take people down a peg or two or enter a note of caution. But it's rare that someone has the ability to do that.
This is, there's a famous thing, of course, in decision science called the Abilene effect, which I think is where everybody agrees with something.
Yes.
To avoid offending the other party, even though not a single individual within the group supports that course of action.
Yes.
It's called the Abilene effect for complex reasons. It's about an anecdote about a bunch of people who all travel to Abilene for the evening, have a horrible time and come back. And one of them says, well, I never wanted to go in the first place. And everybody else echoes the same thing. They all became convinced that everybody else wanted. That actually happened with the Concorde, actually. The British wanted to cancel the programme, but were afraid of offending the French. And the French wanted to cancel the programme, but were afraid of upsetting the British.
No, completely. Yeah. And I mean, it is universal. I mean, it may be the case that there are reasons why that in some cultures, you know, in Britain, more particularly England, people are, you know, don't want to seem to be the troublemaker, don't want to offend. But you're absolutely right. And what you describe happened with Andrew Lansley's health reforms. Andrew put them forward. I'm not sure that many people around the cabinet table actually understood what he was putting forward. But afterwards, when they unravelled, you would not find a single person around the cabinet table who said, oh, yeah, I was gung-ho for them, I was wholly in support. But I don't remember a single person, as they were introduced, saying, and precisely that effect occurred.
I mean, you did affect real change in education, though, it's probably fair to say.
Well, yes, and again, you know, opinion will divide on whether or not it was good or bad.
It was definitely change. I mean,
it was definitely change. It was definitely change. So you could tell from the intensity of the opposition that it was certainly an attempt at change, and actually the fact that I was there for 4 years and that you know, during that time you could see how that opposition peaked at a certain point, and then it still stayed, but there was an acceptance that an alteration had been made, and it was impossible at that stage to move it back. You could see that there was real change, and in effecting change in politics, several things need to come together. It's very rarely the case that you have a single individual visionary who, by either spellbinding rhetoric or by intellectual brilliance, changes things. It's normally a combination of circumstances. And in my case, I was fortunate in that at that point, I had the backing of David Cameron and George Osborne, and also that the coalition government that was formed was one in which the Liberal Democrats found themselves in alignment with our views on education. It was a sort of 1 in 100-year moment where two parties agreed on the direction that needed to happen, and both parties had an interest in making this work, so they could show not just that they could manage the economy together, but change things for the better together. So I was fortunate in that sense. Now, there are obviously things that require to be done in government in order to ensure that even if you have agreement and high-level political support, the change that you actually bring about drives an alteration on the ground. And one of the key things there is, I think, the ability to draw a distinction between the appeal to people's better angels and the reality that idealism only takes you so far. And I think that's one of the key things about changing the public sector and public services, that you need to have, without being unduly cynical, a realist understanding of what the incentives are that truly drive behavior in schools, hospitals, or elsewhere.
This is fascinating. I mean, you did have 4 years, which was another advantage.
Definitely.
The average tenure, I mean, Transport Secretary, for example, is typically held for about 9 months.
Yes.
Whereas you can't even begin to understand the problem in 9 months.
No. And it's the turnover of people in government is undeniably a factor. And there are some jobs, and there's a sort of curious hierarchy within government. There are some jobs that are considered to be places for people on the way down or on the way up, which are not valued as they should be. So there's being the number 2 in the Department for Housing, the housing minister below the Secretary of State is considered to be one of the most prestigious and important Minister of State jobs. So lots of people get it as a way of saying, you're ready for cabinet. You are ready for cabinet. And then as soon as there's a vacancy, which happens, of course, frequently, someone goes up. But that means that even though the job is seen in prestige terms as important, it never gets the attention that it requires, given its importance for the economy and for our society.
I mean, just as the finance department in a business can be a ludicrous block on innovation by demanding ridiculously high levels of proof.
Yes.
Is that true of the Treasury and government?
Emphatically so.
Right.
So the Treasury feels that it's the only adult in the room, it's the only department that is approaching policy making with the necessary degree of cynicism. Every time someone comes forward, and government departments come forward with a requirement for additional public expenditure on the basis that we'll save money in the future. So let's invest money in our prisons now in order to rehabilitate criminals, and then we will save so much more when they're no longer reoffending when they get out, but in fact contributing. Makes sense? This rehabilitation program works, but the Treasury's view always is, we can see the money we're spending now, but in so many occasions, you guys come up with smart ideas and the savings are never realized. Or the savings are made and then you reinvest them in something else. We're there to look out for the poor beleaguered taxpayer, and it is our job to be, as I say, the licensed cynic, the puncturer of ideals, and to safeguard the public finances overall. And while that's, I think, a generally understandable principle, one of the things is that the Treasury also, because of its prestige, draws the very brightest civil servants. So that means that in a roughly equal battle that you might consider where you're arbitrating between a good argument from the Treasury and a good argument from the Education Department, the Treasury nearly always win, because they're smarter people, and whoever the Chancellor is will generally have the ear of the Prime Minister, and as a general rule, the Prime Minister doesn't want to be seen to be upsetting the Chancellor, so the Treasury have a positional advantage. And that's why there are a number of ideas that anyone in this room might consider to be worthwhile that go to the Treasury to die. So it's the elephant's graveyard for policy ideas of even of considerable merit.
And then one final question. Your influence as a journalist, both before and after your political career, do you in some ways feel more powerful as a journalist? And is this also exacerbated by the fact that politicians seem absolutely paranoid about what particularly the printed press says about them?
No, they are. So politicians do worry more than they should about media overall. And even though the influence of printed media, not the Spectator, but the influence of printed media overall is diminishing, they do worry about it. And again, partly it's about in-group pressure. So if you know that many of the people who operate in SW1 are likely to be reading the Spectator or the Times or the Telegraph or listening to the Today programme, that becomes, the village voice. That becomes the village water pump around which gossip is spread and where your reputation is up or down, rather than thinking more broadly. That is just a feature of human nature, sadly. So politicians do worry about that. But in terms of influencing the country in the shape of policy, you do have, if you've got the right team around you, more influence in government, and you can have that influence sometimes as a senior civil servant or an advisor to ministers. But what really makes a difference, whether it comes from a think tank, a government department, an individual politician, or journalists, is the quality of an original idea. So many of the trends that we observe in politics have often had their root in other spheres, whether it's been an observation about what's working in the commercial world or what academia teaches you, that is then taken and popularized or explained very effectively. So in that sense, one might think that one of the most influential columns on politics would be the thing written by the political editor. We have a brilliant political editor, but actually it is often more likely the case that it will be Rory's fortnightly column.
I don't think that, but yeah.
That will have an influence on how people think about politics and the shape of policy. Because original ideas that make people think about what's going on in our country have that. So for those of you who haven't seen it, in Rory's latest column for The Spectator, he describes the existence of a third sector in our country. And when he talks about the third sector, he's not talking about charities. He's saying there's the public sector, there's the private sector, and there's the tantric sector. And the tantric sector is everyone who's involved in making everything last longer.
It's by analogy with the sexual practice, by the way, yes.
Sometimes much longer, without ever necessarily coming to a happy ending, as it were. And it is literally true that one of the things that constrains us all, but certainly constrains us in government, is that there are people who are in the tantric sector. So, and they are people who are...
The blob, I suppose.
The blob, who are often well-intentioned, but whether it's people in Natural England who I have a lot of love for, or the lawyers in government, there will always be people who have an interest in saying, don't do something, an interest in risk aversion, an interest in avoiding conflict, rather than those who want to be radical and to change things. And that's why, and again, I think, hopefully it's of interest to this audience here, if you're thinking about how to persuade politicians of the worth or merit, for example, of interventions on public health, or interventions to enable people to better understand the deleterious effect of the way we live on individuals' mental health. One of the things that you do need to contend with and think about are, if I can see a minister, if I could see a Secretary of State, and if I could persuade them in 15 or 20 minutes, what are the reasons why they haven't yet acted? And what are the reasons that might prevent them, even if they're enthused by what I'm doing? So it's not enough in government just to convince the person who appears to be the decision maker, and no matter how enthusiastic they are, to leave with their assent and to imagine that things will be delivered. You've got to an extent, think about the constraints that operate and how the assemblage within the tantric sector will be seeking to prevent things coming to fruition.
I mean, there is, by the way, a tantric sector within the private sector.
Oh, yes.
Every bit
yes.
as much as there is in the public sector. And by the way, they're often criticized in terms of their cost, in other words, their
yes.
salaries. But their real cost isn't actually their salary. In many ways, what they're doing is worthwhile.
Yes.
The real cost is the extraordinary delays it imposes, or the fact that people lose the will to do anything.
Precisely. So it is probably, I certainly think it's a good thing. It's probably, most people would think it is a good thing, that there is a body at one remove from electoral pressure that advises government and other bodies on the environmental consequences of particular actions. That's a good thing. But the fact that it operates in a way where it takes months before it comes to a conclusion, and the fact that that conclusion can be endlessly, literally re-litigated in the courts, means that the original goal becomes overwhelmed by process. And that's why I think the insight that Rory brings in that column is so true.
Thank you. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
You will be around just for a few moments
Definitely.
for fanboy moments and selfies. Lord Gove, thank you very much indeed.
Rory, thank you.